What's up, archaeologists and adventurers? On today's show, we're digging deeper into my favorite film of all time. That's probably like a way too much of a lead-in, but I love this film, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Welcome to the Story Geek Show, officially part of the Orange Grove 55 network, and you may be listening to this on How Stories Work with Jay Sherer, the official podcast channel. So there's various ways you could be interacting with this particular show. But I will warn you that this show will be spoiler filled. You've had 40 years to watch this film. If you haven't watched it already, I just feel bad for you. You should go watch it right now.
Exactly.
Because I don't know what else to tell you. But let me introduce this illustrious panel of guests that we have today on the Story Geek Show. Starting with one of our frequent guests, another host here on the OG55 channel, Mr. Dre, VashSky. So you've been called the lawyer of lawyers. You've been called the producer Dre. You've been called a number of different things. But can we call you now an archaeologist as well?
I think you can call me an archaeologist for sure, because we're unearthing this 40-year film here.
Yes,
and that's
I'm here for puns as well.
It probably belongs in a museum, and I believe it has been added to the archives, right? So this is absolutely phenomenal, absolutely great. Thank you so much for having me on. Probably also can call me Vash the Stampede, because man, I went crazy on a show yesterday all about Gavin Newsom going to Disneyland. That was a lot of fun. So if you guys like what you're hearing right here, you can definitely join us on Orange Grove 55 as well. We have some amazing shows talking about all things, not even just parks, but the Walt Disney Company and everything related like that. And if you want to see if you want to see more of me, you can go and do so right down there at VashSky. Just go ahead and type it in, and it should pop up for all of that robust discussion right there. And because we're doing this, I'll go ahead and instead of a drop, I'll play a little bit of this. How about this? There you go. Yes. We gotta get us in the mood, and I can't play John Williams, so this is the best thing we can do.
I love it.
Very, very
I love
cool.
it. That we'll probably be mentioning the music at some point in time too, because this film is just full of greatness all across the board. But it is a pleasure to have you with us, Dre, and another longtime friend, many time guest of this show, Mr. Mike Gordon. How are you, Mike?
Howdy, I am glad to be here. Yes, a long time. Yeah, that means I'm old. So I get it. I belong in a museum.
I would, yeah. I would say that you are a mature, excellent source of wisdom. That's what I would say.
I've been called a lot of things before, but mature. Very
Hey,
yeah, fair.
It's not the
Maybe
years,
for this show.
it's the mileage.
That's right. That's
right.
right. That's right. And by the way, for those listening to the audio, you can't see that Mike Gordon has shown up with his Stetson fedora with the same color as, is it the temple? Is it actually the temple hat, or is it a different version?
It is. I believe I bought this before Temple of Doom.
Okay.
So I mean, it's got the Indiana Jones logo on it.
Yeah.
It used to have an Indiana Jones pin,
Nice.
but I don't know where that went. So I had my hat pin, but yeah, this is very dear to me.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's awesome. I was telling the guys I have a number of fedoras, but I don't have an Indy one, and so I'm like, why don't I have an Indy one? Like, I even have one Stetson. But they're not Indy ones. What have I been doing with my life? Well, let's. Where can people find you, by the way, Mike? I know you're part of the ESO network. You're part of the ESO podcast.
Right. I host a weekly show, not daily, not yet. We come out twice a week now.
Oh, nice.
On Earth Station One, and that podcast is all about pop culture. We've talked about Indiana Jones several times on that show. I think now I'm not supposed to, so I welcome any time that I get to, because I've talked about it too much. Although I'm sure we'll talk about him in about a month, right? Yeah. So it's a big deal over there. Also, you can look at my writing and the comics and everything else that I'm publishing at newlegendmike.com.
Yes, definitely check out Tiki Zombie. Fantastic comic. Very action oriented, very kitschy humor is what I would call it. And it's very well done. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we're going to jump in and talk about Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. I've already said that it's my favorite movie, so I'm just going to come out right out the gate and say that of any movie that I could give a 10 out of 10 to, this is the movie that I give a 10 out of 10 to, which I don't do very often, but like this is the one. This is the you know, it's all the kids out there are constantly saying it's peak this, it's peak that. To me, this is peak cinema, right? Like this is just phenomenal. So let me go around the horn here, and Dre, what do you give this on a scale of 1 to 10?
You know, you have to have a 10, right? You have to, a 10 has to exist. It can't just always be, well, 9, 8, you know, gets up there, but it's not perfect. You know, there has to be a 10. I think, I think this is a 10. I think I agree with you, Jay. This is peak cinema right here, and delivered at the perfect time too, I think. And it's we'll get into it, but it's one of the reasons why this has become so iconic. It's not just in you know, that it was made in general, but when it was made and when it was released, I think it contributes to a lot of the lore of this thing. But yeah, it's just got to be a 10. I mean, it's just perfect casting, a very tight contained script. We'll talk about certain segments of it, I'm sure, but you know, it's just a great directorial effort by Steven Spielberg. Obviously, him collaborating with George Lucas is just the perfect marriage, right? And you got John Williams' amazing score, like we referenced before, right there. Like, what is there not to like about this movie? And it plays. It honestly does. I actually saw this film, I believe, last year. There was a re-exhibition of it. I believe there's going to be an exhibition of it again this year in the lead up to Dial of Destiny at select theaters. I mean, it's just phenomenal. I mean, it's just like, you know, you're chewing popcorn, and 40 years after this thing comes out, you know, is it as relevant as it was before? Maybe not. You know, there's been some passage of time, but it still plays. It still plays, and it's still way up there. So, got to be 10 out of 10.
Could not agree more. I've been watching, for those of you who've been following along, I appreciate you, because I've been literally watching all the Indiana Jones content that exists, meaning I've been watching and I didn't know how many actual episodes of Young Indiana Jones there were. And now I'm going through it. I'm like, oh my gosh, my life is basically Indiana Jones at this point. But I watched all 3 of the original films so far. I'm still going to watch Crystal Skull here in a minute, and you could not be more right. I mean, it still plays today, and it is like, this is still an amazing film. It is timeless in so many ways, and we'll talk about that more as well. But Mike, what do you think? Like, what is this on a scale of 1 to 10?
Well, I mean, I can't be at all objective when it comes to Lost Ark, which is how I know it. By the way, yeah. Not Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Raiders of the Lost Ark for me. Of course. But yeah, I mean, I saw this when it first came out, and I just fell in love with it, and it changed everything. Star Wars made a big impact on my life, made a big impact on all our lives.
Of course.
But Raiders was the one that really hit me personally. To this day, I'm not sure exactly. Well, I mean, I do know some elements of why that could be, but as far as why it so effectively touched me, I don't know. But it did, and it changed my life. I became a huge fan of the movie. Have bought it in every single medium that it's been released on, even on Laserdisc. I've never owned a Laserdisc player, but I still own it on Laserdisc. I would own the 35 millimeter prints if I could, and every time, like when the Blu-rays came out, they got shipped to my house, I opened it immediately and watched the movie. And I mean, I don't know if I've seen a movie more than this. And it does hold up for me, even though I can quote it backward and forward and sideways. It just means so much to me. And every time I watch it, I notice something new, which is, I mean, I think that's the beauty of it as well, is that it's so deep in the content, in the writing, in the acting, in the performances, in the settings, in the achievements that it does with stunts. On every level, there's just something to watch and something to notice, and I never get tired of it.
Yeah.
So 10 for me. I agree, Dre. I agree that I don't. Those people that are like, well, you can never have a perfect 10. I'm like, well, then why have the number? Like, right. like And there may be, I'm a big movie file. I've seen tons of movies. There may be movies that are arguably greater or better made or better period than this, but none are my favorites more than this movie. If you asked me what my top 5 movies were, the other 4 would probably change depending on when and where you asked me. But that number 1 spot is always going to be devoted to Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yep. Oh, it's the same with me. And it's interesting because you said something that I think is resonates with me a lot. And that is, this had a huge impact on me as well. And I don't know if I could exactly tell you why. I can tell you the byproduct of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you this is the movie that inspired me to be a writer. Like today, all the stuff that I write is all because these people decided to make this film. It is what I will go back to if I need to feel like I'm at home. You could show me this movie on any portion of the planet. It could probably be in a different language, and I'd be like, I'm home, because this movie just feels like home. For whatever that means. It was made the year that I was born, so I did not see it in theaters. But from the time that I could see it, and by the way, I saw them in order this way because my parents wouldn't let me watch Temple of Doom for longer. So I saw Raiders, I saw Crusade, and then I saw Temple. But it's just to be able to say that something inspired you to pursue something as a lifelong portion of your career or your hobby or whatever you want to call it. It's something that inspired you to do that is amazing. Like it's astounding. I think it comes from a place of imagination. George Lucas, if there is anybody that you would say has one of the most lively, creative senses of imagination, like you'd have to give the award to George Lucas with what he's been able to inspire. I don't even think he's the best writer. I don't think he's the best producer. I don't think he's the best of any of those things. But if you're giving an award for imagination and storytelling, I'm like, how can you not put George Lucas on the list of people you'd give it to? I mean, it's really amazing. We'll get into sort of like the philosophy behind this and like how in the world this got made, because I think that's a really interesting question. But Dre,
that's a good story.
How impactful was this for you?
Oh my God, unbelievably impactful. So I was born in 1990, so this is good almost 10 years before I was even born. I know, right? It's great. but no, this will be encouraging. Well, okay, so my only exposure to this was literally a VHS copy of it that the parents bought, and it's like, okay, well, here, try this on for size, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I was like, oh, okay. I don't even know when I first saw it. It's just been always part of my lexicon. But I can tell you the first time I saw it, I was like, this is awesome. This is absolutely amazing. Again, 10 years after this film comes out, it's still resonating with me as a kid, even though there had been subsequent films that had been released. And it just was mind-blowing, epic, unbelievably amazing, and has always been to me one of the best films ever made, one of my favorite films by far. And I'm like, okay, I want to be Indiana Jones. So I would dress up like him. I had to get the hat, had to do all this stuff. And so when the ride was coming out and being produced at Disneyland, my favorite place in the world is not going to have my favorite franchise featured in this mind-blowing epic attraction. I was like, oh, this is freaking awesome. All these things are coming together in the perfect way growing up. And so I'm all dressed there as Indiana Jones. We get in line and we saddle up, and it's like, okay, let's see how tall you are. This short right there.
No
just
way.
This short.
Can you raise the hat a bit?
Yeah.
I know, right? And I'm devastated, and I had to wait for them by the unload area, and I just see these Jeeps go in, and I'm like, man, what is on the other side here, But my mom was like, you know what? We're not leaving until until you get on this thing. So, I think they put some stuff in my shoes right there. Got in, or right just on the height limit road, and it obviously the rest is history there. But it all kind of started. The germination of all of that started with the actual film itself, and it's been transformative for so many people. Even Tony Baxter, for example, right? He was like, after this, he's like, the next the Walt Disney in in our lifetime is here. It's George Lucas. Yeah. He's very inspired by this film specifically to partner up with George Lucas to bring his ideas not just to Disney but to the parks specifically, right? And it was all about, could we create like a rip-roaring adventure like the original film Raiders of the Lost Ark could propel you through. And that's when the development of the enhanced motion vehicle started and all of that. So it wasn't just transformative to our lives, but to the lives of filmmakers, of storytellers, of creatives throughout the entire industry. It just changed the planet. And you have to give it to George Lucas. I mean, look, I don't think there's any single person that's contributed to film and cinema and effects more than him. So lifetime achievement reward for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm gonna start with a softball question that we just went into, like how it impacted us, and that's really cool. But I want to start with a softball question because I've got some deeper questions here too. This film has multiple action sequences. Some of these are the best action sequences of all time, in my personal opinion. There's a plethora of options in just this film alone. But which action sequence in Raiders? I'll start with you, Mike. Which one is your personal favorite?
In the beginning, the opening sequence that happens in Peru, the crypt, it just captivates me. I love the setup. I love the fact that we learn about Indy through a series of tests, going through these, trying to get around all these booby traps. And it's great setup for that when he finally has that iconic moment where he replaces, he grabs the idol. And that, then afterwards, all of those booby traps are still in effect. We know them, we've seen them. And so he's going through them and then culminating with the most iconic thing that maybe has ever been put on screen with the boulder coming down, which we didn't see at all. I mean, it was a big surprise and yet still works. It's, looking back on it now, it's ridiculous. And yet it works in this movie and it just is, it's so unbelievable. It sets you up for the entire franchise, really. Yeah. Not to mention it sets up like many, many, many other franchises after this. I mean, this is now the template for, Tomb Raider and anything that deals with like going through, some sort of archaeological dig or, tomb raiding or whatever you want to call it, or adventure. There's always going to be booby traps. So you have to like get around and everything like that. I'm not saying Raiders did it first, but man, they did it better than anybody else, I think. Yeah. And so much so that everybody wanted to do it afterwards.
Yes.
And it's just like, and not only the action, but you get to learn about Indy as a character. And it's those character moments that really propel the whole sequence as well. Then you can relate to him. It's just beautifully well done. And like I said, it sets the tone for the entire franchise. It's one of the most amazing, 10 minutes or whatever that you'll find, I think, on film.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. What about you, Dre? What do you think? Well,
I'll include my extended thoughts on that specific scene when we get to the introduction of character segment, because that's mine for that one. But that action sequence, I mean, and two of the traps are in the ride. You got the boulder, then you got the darts.
That's right.
And so it's like, okay, that's cool. But no, a phenomenal action sequence, no question about it. It's, like I said, 10 minutes. But I think in terms of action sequences, I'm going to shout out two, but one of them's my favorite. The when Indy is kind of battling big dude with the plane, and that whole sequence right there.
Yes.
Yeah, the wing.
Phenomenal. Yeah. And even George Lucas, he gave credit to Steven Spielberg. just saying the way that the way that is edited, the way that you can cut between, you know, what's going on with Indy himself, what's going on with Marion in the actual plan itself, when you have the fuel kind of spilling out and it's creating a threat scenario, and then cutting, you know, between all of these segments, and also too we have to catch up with the villains as well, what they're doing at this time. You're having to balance all that out, balance out the pacing, and how the music flows from one cut to the other. It's just absolutely phenomenal, just on a technical level and a creative achievement level. It's just so good. You got to give it up to that scene for sure. But I think my favorite it's got to be the truck scene. The truck scene is just it's just so fun to watch, and I believe some of that was done by Second Unit. But still though, it's just so good. It's so visceral. Like if you feel like you're right there and you're hanging on for dear life. It's so rough and tumble, you know, and and when I compare new indie scenes, like let's say Crystal Skull or even Dial of Destiny, some of the portions that we've seen, that's the standard. And when it's not up to that standard, it's like, you know, it feels like some of that stuff's being filmed in the studio, whereas the truck sequence really does feel like you're really on the side of that truck with Indy, just trying to hold on and, you know, punch those Nazi. I can't say it. Punch those 1930s Germans out.
Yeah. Those Germans of ill repute. yeah.
And Germans of ill repute, right? But you know, he's going through there, you know, getting lost underneath, having to climb over, and he's just, you know, he's rough and tumble, and he's taking the hits, he's taking the punches. I love the feel of that sequence so much, right? You could just feel the dirt on your hands afterwards and the grit and the grime. It is just fantastic. So I got to give it the truck sequence.
And there's all these little things. So a couple things I want to just mention from some of the action sequences we just talked about, and then I'll tell you what my favorites are. But the first one is when you're watching that fight scene where the big guy comes out, takes off his shirt, and he's like, "I'm going to fight Indiana Jones. Clearly, I'm going to win." Right?
Right.
There's this thing that Harrison Ford does that I don't know if it was a Spielberg idea. I don't know if Harrison Ford came up with it. I don't know if it's in the script. I have not looked. But one time when the guy punches him, his knees go out on him. And I'm like, that little detail tells you all you need to know about how this fight will go if Indy doesn't outthink this guy, right? Like, like he's not gonna win. We've seen him fight other people and win, but he is going to lose in this fist fight. And you're right, the blocking on that scene, I cannot imagine the nightmare that would have been. But however they managed that, like,
because it's
cow.
Turning, right? The
turning.
plane is turning. She's there, you know, doing her kind of thing, and you know, then she gets stuck. So you know, Indy has to do his thing. You've got the propeller and the interplay between those two things. By the way, one of the best deaths ever. By the way, totally. And they don't even show it, but it's so gruesome. It's awesome. It's one of those Jaws. You don't necessarily see the shark, but you see the effect, and that is fantastic. And then you have the lake of the running gas right there. Yeah, so you're only going to get a couple shots of that.
Absolutely.
That must have been a nightmare. You're totally spot on, Jay.
Yeah. It's just that's phenomenal. The other thing that I wanted to call out was in the truck scene, which is my second favorite. So that is my second favorite.
Okay.
In the truck scene, even just the fact that when he goes underneath, they had to dig a trench out for as long. I don't know if you guys know about how this was filmed. They had to dig a trench out underneath the course of how they were going to drive that truck because he was too close otherwise. So they dug a trench out, and you can kind of see it if you're watching closely. But the movie magic that is done with practical effects is out of this world. Like it is next level amazing how they figured out, we're going to do this stunt. This is what the stunt is going to be. How do we figure this out, guys? And then they figured it out. It's phenomenal. So that is
I love that stunt. It is it's a great stunt. Of course, it's inspired by, I can't remember the stuntman's name, but he did a stunt back in the like 30s or 40s on a Western where he did the same thing with, on a horse and like the horse.
Like stagecoach type of deal?
Yeah, stagecoach, right?
Yeah.
But that sequence also has my favorite, like, making of Raiders line in it, making of almost any other movie, is that when they're getting ready to shoot Harrison, like being dragged, because they actually drag him for a little bit, obviously not a lot, but they are dragged. And so, he's preparing, and someone asks him behind the camera, someone says, "So, Harrison, you ever been dragged by a truck before?" And he goes, "Dragged by a truck. Dragged by a truck. Nope." He goes, "It's just one more useless experience."
That's amazing.
And I'm like,
up.
that's Indiana Jones. That's Indiana Jones saying that. Like, I mean, the line blurs between Harrison and Indy right there. And I think that's another reason why it works so well.
Yep.
Yeah. It's so true. So love that sequence. Even the parts where where they add comedy. Like, I think it's so funny when they run over the one body. I know it sounds terrible. But they run over the body and his arms go up.
Well, that's what makes it fun,
funny.
Though.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you hate this guy and you want to see this guy get his comeuppance, and he gets it. It's hilarious.
It's hilarious.
I think it's a great one.
Oh, I love it. Anyway, so that's my second favorite one, but my first favorite is the same as yours, Mike. Because I watched it again this time, and like we've all said, like, we're finding stuff that's new. The thing that I found new this time was that in an era of CG, just rampant CG, like cool new things like the volume are out there and they're doing cool stuff with that. But when you go back and I'm looking behind, so Indy's got the bag of sand and there's the idol, and I'm looking behind him and I'm going, that's all set pieces.
Yep.
Somebody went in and they built all that stuff and they added that moss and they said, we need more moss because it doesn't look mossy enough. And somebody did all that stuff and it looks better than any CG could look, because they literally replicated what it would have looked like in real life if you were there. And I think so you mentioned Tony Baxter, and one of the things that occurs to me is that, like, when I ride that ride, it feels like they did the same thing. They took the same care. You could literally go and film an Indiana Jones film using the ride as your set pieces. Yes. And that's just really inspiring that there's that kind of creativity and there's those kind of folks that are there. Go ahead, jump in, Dre. What were you gonna say?
Well, no, I was just gonna say it set the standard, right? That set design and that introduction sets the standard for the entire franchise, and also the ride. I'm sure Tony had conversations. It's like, it's got to look this good, guys. It's got to look like you're jumping into an Indiana Jones adventure. So it's just phenomenal how that. Right there, we got to actually see that at one point, and that they were able to take the relatively modest production budget that they actually had, and created a set piece that was so immersive. I guess is the word you would use now. It's
totally immersive. And last thing I'll say is that after that sequence ends, and he's with Belloc, and then he escapes. That last section where he's running down the hill, he's got all of the local people behind him with all of their blow darts and their arrows and everything else. And Jock Lindsay is sitting on the lake fishing, and he's barreling down. And Jock's kind of like, "Well, I got to fish. I can't take off now." And Indiana Jones is like, "We've got to take off, dude." And then he gets up in the plane, and this is so indicative of what you were saying, Mike, earlier about, like, them revealing through action what Indy is all about. Is he sees a snake and he's more scared than he's been the entire time by the snake in the plane, right? Like, it's so magical in the way that they play all of that out. It's just, I could geek out on this for probably the rest of the night. But you guys all chose great stuff there. Fantastic conversation. So I'm just going to continue with this kind of line of thinking because I'm curious as to your guys' thoughts on this. So to me, and as we've talked about, it's for sure true of you guys as well, Indiana Jones represents originality, pure movie-making joy, the brilliance of creativity. It's a film about an archaeologist. Like, this is coming from the brain of George Lucas, which is completely madness. And he goes, I'm going to do a film about an archaeologist that's searching for powerful artifacts, and I'm going to try and prevent those artifacts from being used for evil. And it's all done in this classic pulp serial story style. which I love, by the way. It's one of the most beloved films in cinematic history. But do you think, based on all like the pitch that you would have had to made to get this film into theaters, do you think, Dre, I'll start with you, do you think this film would even get made today?
Well, it barely got made at the time. That's the crazy thing is you have Steven Spielberg, who just came off of the biggest blockbuster, the first blockbuster ever, essentially, with Jaws, right? And that, I mean, the hell that was the production of that movie. He thought he was going to work at all. He goes off to, I believe, Hawaii, build some sandcastles, get away from it all. And well, it turns out it's the biggest movie of all time. And he didn't even know that until he came back into the world. But that started the tradition. And well, George Lucas has his own experience with his own film with the original Star Wars back in 1977. Just a hellish experience there. And well, they were good friends at the time. So Steven's like, hey, George, this is what you got to do. You got to do what I did with Jaws. Let's go to Hawaii together. Let's get away from it all. Whatever happens, happens, but at least we'll have a good time. And, they're out there, building sandcastles out there on the beach. And they're like, you know what? It's interesting, the cinematic lives that we've had, but what's the project that we both want to do? What's the one thing we both want to do? It's like, we want to make a James Bond film. And they come to the conclusion very quickly that the family will never sign out the rights for them to do it. So it's like, well, what if we made our own James Bond? And that's the origins of the character, right? And even though they have had massive success with Jaws and Star Wars, the level of compensation, the budget they were asking was there's no way, no studio would say yes. They took it to multiple studios, and they eventually got to Michael Eisner with Paramount at the time, and it was like, here's our idea. And Michael Eisner, he knows talent. He knows when a big thing's popping off. It's like, well, we got to get in business with these guys, and signs the deal that years later Disney themselves would have to negotiate with Paramount, interestingly enough. But that's besides the point. And it gets made, and it's quite the adventure, because this was, the studio system of the golden area of cinema, where everything was made in the studio and everything that was definitely expired by this point. You had this kind of new era of creatives who were like, let's take the camera outside the studio, let's film it on location, right? And camera technology had advanced to the point which that was really feasible. But this was still something where it was like, we're going to be in Africa, like we're going to be in Tunisia, and we're going to be filming with the populace there. We're going to be in, did they film in South America?
That's a good question. Know that? I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know, but it feels real, right? And you have to be in a jungle at some point. And that's really, really difficult. And for the studio to agree to that, I mean, that's a big ask, a big risk. And so, yeah, I mean, creating this film now in the way that it was done before, I just don't think you can do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why the attempts to recapture this, like with Crystal Skull and Dot Destiny, don't quite work as well as what they did before, because at the time it was produced, especially, coming off of the kind of cynical era of cinema, right? Where everything has to have an edge, where everything has to have this, kind of pulp adventure like this.
Yeah.
It was just lightning in a bottle. And it was the perfect antidote to the actual cinema that was actually taking place at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, it was Kauai. It was actually Kauai. So I looked it up in South America, and that film was Kauai. Yeah. So
gotcha.
Pretty wild. What do you think? Mike? Could this film get made today?
It would be it's very unlikely. For all the reasons that Dre mentioned, the fact that, it was lucky to be made at all. I mean, obviously it had the three highest grossing movies, behind it. Like, the guys who had made Jaws, Close Encounters. That's how they sold the movie to people. Like, they said, this from the makers of Jaws, Close Encounters, Star Wars, boom, boom, boom. Like, you'll want to see this because these guys made it, right? And that's exactly what Paramount was counting on. But yeah, I mean, the old time serials that Lucas grew up with, that he loved, he didn't, they weren't being made anymore, not even close to anything like this before. Harrison Ford was still kind of not a big name. I mean, obviously he'd made a name for himself in Star Wars and a couple other movies, but I mean, this is the movie that would really catapult him to stardom, I think, and it just sealed the deal that, you know, he was never going to get like minimum wage ever again. So, and, you know, I mean, George was, we all know that, you know, before Star Wars, George tried to get the rights to Flash Gordon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that failed. So then he created his own. And in doing so, I think he really learned the lesson that, hey, if I create my own IPs, you know, the back end is going to really be very profitable for me.
Absolutely.
So even though I know that, or I understand that he was a big Alan Quatermain fan, and these kind of things had been done before, so it wasn't like I don't know that I would call this like very creative, like original, like or like like creatively original, because this had been, you know, done before. Had it been done this well? No.
Right.
And had it been done in a while? No. So they really kind of dug this whole genre back from like I mean, it hadn't been really done in like maybe at that point 20, 30 years maybe, not on this scale. And so, yeah, asking a studio to do that, even though, you know, now it would cost a lot more money than it did then, because everything costs more money now. Yeah. And it certainly wouldn't be made like it is now. I mean, It would be all CG. They'd be fun of. I mean, look at the last two Indiana Jones movies. Exactly. This one that's coming out and the last one, all CG, right? Yep. Not practical at all. So, so it certainly wouldn't have been done. And other concerns too. I mean, you know, the religious aspect of it, the fact that it's not that diverse. Some of the, you know, you could argue that some of the things are not very politically, like, you know, cool now. There might be, you know, problematic now, things of that nature. It would be a very, very, very different movie. And that's unfortunate because, you know, this movie has proven to me, and not just like, you know, with the fact that it's still a valuable IP, but the fact that hearing you two guys who didn't see it in the theater initially, you know, who saw it like later on, still resonated as powerfully for you guys as it did for me. And that says, like, that tells me more than anything, like that this movie is a unique, you know, piece of art that and look, we all know that it's a miracle when a good movie is made, right? Like, it's just like the lightning has to hit at the right time. And it really did for this movie. So, you know, I don't see a studio. I mean, studios now wouldn't put up the money for something that was a brand new IP. They just wouldn't.
Right.
It's definitely a risk, and I think look, if George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were part of this thing, this doesn't get made. There's no question, right? But look, you know, it is derivative for sure of some of those earlier concepts representing pop culture at the time. But because of where it was placed. In terms of when it actually was released, it feels fresh, feels original, and I think that's the big coup de grace for this film is that they're taking concepts that worked before, you know, re-envisioning them and putting them into a modern context the right way. There's a wrong way to do that, but definitely do it the right way and recapture some of that magic. It reminds me of like I think the closest thing to this extent, probably Pirates of the Caribbean when that actually came out. You know, nobody had produced a swashbuckler 50 years or something before that actually comes out. A lot of people felt that was a dead genre. But you know, when that is introduced to the public in the way it was and with the level of quality that it was, it feels fresh, feels new, feels like, you know, nothing else we've ever seen before. And I think for you know, if anybody's listening to this and remember what that time period was like, that's probably the closest analogy to when this was actually produced and released.
Or even like Iron Man, you know, because you know, superhero movies were not something anybody was interested in, and then Iron Man changed all of that.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, you made me think of like the last pirate movie I can think of prior to Pirates of the Caribbean was Cutthroat Island.
Yeah.
You remember that? And I was like, that didn't go anywhere at all. This is I totally agree with both of you. I don't think this film gets made for all of the reasons that you guys mentioned. Just to double down on a couple of them, it would be a CG mess is what it would be, and it would, to double down on your comment, Mike, we're only funding IP at this point.
Yep.
We're not giving. Yeah, there are like Everything Everywhere All at Once. Yes, there are breakout independent films, but like even a big studio didn't get behind that film, right? Like that was an A24 film.
Right.
So I've heard people say, well, the problem with today's film is that it's all based on IP, and people will argue like, no, you're just not watching the right films. And it's like, yeah, because the big studios are not putting money behind these kinds of films. They're only putting money behind kind of IP based films.
And it's actually, that mentality is growing, unfortunately. Matt Bellany had a great article on Puck talking about Pixar and how one of the places in which original film would come out and be financially viable for the studios even today was in animation. Even then, it's like, well, have you looked at Mario? Have you looked at Puss in Boots? Have you looked at some of the stuff that is a sequel or something like that? Maybe even in the animation context, we shouldn't be pursuing this. And there are legitimate conversations to that effect taking place right now. But a film like this, with this budget, with this wide release and so forth, I don't think it gets done unless you have a really kind of creative head attached to it. Probably the closest analogy to this is probably Christopher Nolan, right? Yeah. He can bring an original film to life because he's Christopher Nolan.
Right, because that's his selling point. Yeah.
Right,
like, he's the only one that, like any other buddy, makes Oppenheimer, and it's released in the fall and winter, right?
Oh, exactly. 100%. It's not a summer blockbuster. Yeah.
But it really strikes. I was taken aback. Like, it was about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago or so. I was reading an article, interview with Steven Spielberg, and he was talking. I can't remember which movie he was talking about, but he was talking about having to pitch this movie to, I don't know what, some studio or something like that. And I was like, this guy still needs to pitch.
Yeah.
If Steven just can't say, I want to make this movie, and it gets made, nobody can.
Right.
Basically.
Exactly. Oh, it's so true. That's so true. So yeah, I don't think that this movie gets made today. It certainly doesn't get made the way that it got made in today's world, and we would have never seen this magic. Last thing I wanted to say, just to pick up on a couple of things that you guys were already saying that I'm realizing maybe for the first time, is the fact that they did get lucky in a couple ways too, but the fact that they had this idea that we were going to create James Bond, but then they said, you know what, he's got to be an American version of James Bond. And then, to your point, Mike, they're pulling from this legacy of like British explorers predominantly, right? Like whenever you see like the people exploring the pyramids and unearthing things in Egypt, a lot of it's colonial Britain for the most part, right? And they could go, well, let's put this American in that scenario and see how that kind of plays itself out. Not that there wasn't other versions of Americans doing similar things, but yeah, just so many things.
I just watched the original King Kong for the first time in a long time, and that's very much like, I was like thinking about it and going, wow, this is an American, like what do they call him, like game hunter kind of guy.
Yeah.
And it's got that same sense of adventure. Very successful, of course, very influential. That movie turns out to be as well. And but you're right, it was rare. It was rare.
Yeah. So it's just capturing lightning in a bottle, like you guys mentioned. Okay, so question 3. I'll start with you on this one, Mike. Raiders does something that I find to be very bold. And we've seen it in a lot of movies and a lot of films, but I don't think it always works. And that is that it balances physical threats with paranormal and supernatural threats. Obviously we all love this movie, so I have a feeling that you do think it works, but why would it work, or why would it not work? And how did they capture this in such a way that makes us it makes it so appealing to us?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, because I'm not even sure that, how well aware they were that this was a bold move. Because certainly, a lot of the pulp stuff was very much dealing with occultish things and that nature. although we can get into like most of that was like more tribal, than
Right.
it was like, actual Christian lore.
Yeah.
But I mean, it still was, going to the jungles and that kind of thing was very much a thing back in those early serials. But the supernatural element, I think also at the time that it wasn't as much of a risk because I think a lot of movies were doing it successfully. Not adventure movies because that wasn't really a thing then. But if you look at like the 70s, like the early 70s, especially thrillers like The Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby or The Omen, like these are movies that are like done and they have this sense of like dread and this sort of like supernatural demonic quality to them that is really, really effective and was really big with the box office. I mean, those movies did really, really well, and they were really scary and unnerving. And I think it was something that at that point, I mean, a lot of us were. I mean, I remember being caught up in supernatural things at the time and unexplained phenomenon, whether it was UFOs or Bigfoot or cryptids or anything like that. I mean, we had a whole series called In Search of, where Leonard Nimoy was looking for this stuff.
Right.
I mean, it was just something that was in the ether at that time.
Right.
And we all loved exploring that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. What about you, Dre? What do you think? Does it work here? Where does it work? Where does it not work?
I think it works, and because it is dealing with Judeo-Christian, references and so forth. I think you're okay even now. I mean, we're seeing even today. I believe Russell Crowe was just in a film featuring the Vatican exorcism and all that.
Oh, that's
kind
right.
of
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. The Pope's
So it
exorcist.
kind of like
yeah.
like it. I think that stuff's still viable, but when you're trying to go to the trying to unearth the Ark of the Covenant, and you're going into Middle Eastern countries and so forth. It's like well now it's like we have to be authentic and we have to be really kind of careful how we depict this or that and the other thing. I think you could, because it's not like they treat the lore and subject matter very seriously, and they kind of establish that tone. One of my favorite scenes in the entire film actually is that exposition scene when he's explaining to the guys this is what the Lost Ark is, and even George Lucas himself has said that's a really awesome scene from Steven Spielberg, because you had to have that scene. So how do you do it in an interesting way? And he's got the chalkboard there, and you have the natural audio resonance from the actual room itself, and it's going through there, and I think it's just phenomenally done. But it says right here, hey, look, this is the staff of Ra, and this is the power of the Ark. I think you could do that, and obviously everybody gets their comeuppance at the end, and it's all depicted really, really nicely. But even like the depictions of the Ark itself are done in such a way that there was research applied to it. If you read the passages in the Bible on how the Ark actually looks, it's pretty similar to what we get in the film. It's really kind of interesting how that is actually handled. And there was this concept. I don't know how far it got. I don't know how far it went, but apparently there was this concept before they settled on the plot for Dial of Destiny. There was this idea that you could bring the Ark back in this way, and pairing it with, I guess, the spear that contacted Jesus.
Oh, sure.
I believe. And I don't know what that artifact is called, but you could somehow combine these relics essentially and have its own story take place, and how that is even viable today. And I thought, I think you could do that. So it just all depends on how you actually depict these things. And when we get to Temple of Doom in a future video, that dynamic changes pretty good there. I think Last Crusade might fall in the middle there, so we'll get to that. But
Interesting.
I think with how this is depicted, and how obviously Steven Spielberg is Jewish origin himself,
Right.
how this is all done, I think is done pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think the reason why I included this question is because I did a whole video about what makes Indiana Jones work as a character. And obviously, the three of us haven't seen Dial of Destiny yet. Some others have. That you could apply this logic to Dial of Destiny as well. Note that this logic does not work for Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which may be why that film wasn't received as well. But you have two things going on with Indy, and the first one comes from, I'm stealing it from the script notes guys. Script Notes is hosted by John August and Craig Mazin. Craig Mazin having a phenomenal time with the stuff that he's put out most recently, The Last of Us. And what they were talking about was Indiana Jones always learns to, and they were talking specifically about this film, but it can also be applied to Temple and Crusade. Indy learns to value people over things, but he always starts the film valuing things over people. And so you'll kind of notice that he's even the first time he meets Marion, she punches him in the face because he's like, I just want you so I can get the head of the staff of Ra. I'm not here to see you, right? And it's this idea that over the course of time, he's almost willing to blow up the Ark of the Covenant for her, right? So it's like, okay, so he's over the course of time. Now that scene works itself out where he has to make a choice, and the choice he makes is like, okay, wait a minute, maybe I won't blow it up because they're going to kill her anyways, right? Like, so his journey is not a smooth one. It has lots of like very human qualities to it.
Yeah.
But the other part that I tack on to that line of thinking is I also don't think that Indiana Jones works as a character if he doesn't go from skeptic to reluctant believer by the end of them all. And that's where the reason I think both of those things work is because those two problems are incredibly human problems. We walk about our daily lives realizing that we need to value people over things and getting that tripped up sometimes in our pursuit of whatever we're trying to do. But also there's now I'm a Christ follower, so I do believe in supernatural, obviously. However, I am geared mentally to be far more of a skeptic. So I walk through life every morning waking up and being like, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, and so the journey that Indy goes through is the same journey that most human beings will go through. And I think that just resonates. And if you only have one of those without the other, I think you lack something of the experience, right? So
well, that's what and
just,
oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, just to finalize the point, in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, he already knows. He already knows that the beings exist. He starts the film knowing that the beings exist. He doesn't have to change over time to go like, oh yeah, they're here. There's no point at which he's skeptical. He goes, I know that they're here because I'm the one that I was there at Roswell, right? Like, so there's that aspect of it, and then the valuing people and things as well. Like he doesn't seem to. He's literally not even chasing after the crystal skull so much as he's chasing after his friend who's kind of lost his mind. So those two things break down in that film, and I think that those things are so quintessentially Indiana Jones that it feels wrong if we see him in any other setting. So I'm curious to see how Dial of Destiny pulls that off. But sorry, Dre, you go ahead. What were you gonna say?
No, well, and that kind of skepticism is set up early on with partly in the exposition sequence that we talked about before, but also there's that one scene with Marcus Brody, right? That one scene right before he gets on the plane, and it's like, you know what you're doing here? This is the Ark of the Covenant. It's like, well, I'm not into all that. Come on, Marcus. It's going to be fine. It's okay. And then by the end, you feel that he's kind of gotten an understanding. They really hit this point home. And I think maybe too far, maybe not enough. I'm not sure. But in Temple of Doom, they really kind of, fortune and glory, kid, fortune and glory. And then at the end, it's like, I understand its power now, kind of thing. He has changed as a dynamic character in that piece, and but there's still some of that cynicism left, I suppose, because that's a prequel for Raiders. Right. It's an interesting thing, but it's it's a great point, Jay. I think that he's experienced, obviously. He's got that great introductory piece, right? But he's also relatable in that he is a skeptic in this way, and through his adventure. He kind of, he has that, kind of X-Files moment where it's like, okay, I understand.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, you're right. It is a great counterpoint because he starts off with Marcus and he's like, I don't believe a lot of hocus pocus, et cetera, et cetera. Exactly. And then by the end, he's like, when they're going to open it, he's like, shut your eyes, Marianne. Because he's like, this is what's coming. Like, I believe that something is going to happen here.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's all those, you guys have already mentioned two phenomenal lines that appear, but even when he's teaching his class, he goes, the archaeology is the search for facts. If you want truth, philosophy 101 is down the corridor, right?
Right.
So like every single portion of his character is like, I don't do that stuff. I just find stuff in the ground, right? So just phenomenal stuff here.
Awesome.
Mike, I'll come back to you on this one. To start with you. Raiders was released in 1981, which means that it was being made in the late 70s and early 80s. Does it feel like a film that was made in the late 70s and early 80s? Because the decade of the late 70s through the 80s, really through the end of the 80s, is a very distinct decade of film and filmmaking. So I'm wondering if it feels like it was made in that decade. Does it not feel like it was made in that decade? And if so, what makes it obvious that it was made in the 80s and what makes it feel timeless?
Well, at this question, my first thought is like, all right, my old man part of me says, well, they don't make movies like that anymore.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, the film itself, I think, has a, as we've mentioned before, a timeless quality to it. Like I said, it's effective to people who watch it after it was released, many years, and that's a true testament to, I think, how well it's made. But the way it was made, as we've already talked about, would not be made the same way now. And it does use a lot of elements that, I guess, we should be thankful that for as many things as it does handle, as far as, maybe possibly potentially problematic issues, it's pretty tame, compared to a lot of things that were done around that time. Right. But I also feel like, as you pointed that, right, the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, we're opening up to adventure movies, adventure blockbuster movies. Yeah. And, Jaws, Close Encounters, Star Wars, obviously, Raiders, are at the forefront of that movement. Star Trek as well. There's just this huge wave of all these movies that people want to go see. They're craving these adventures. They're much more adventurous. They don't seem to make adventure movies as much anymore, or they haven't as in the last, I'd say 15, 20 years. And so from that element, I think, yes, it is a product of its time, a great product of its time. One of the pinnacles, obviously, for every one of Raiders, you have 20 movies that are just, they can't get it right. But as far as the themes and the actual movie itself, I think that's more timeless. The fact that it doesn't take place in the 80s,
right?
Yes,
I think is still key component of why that works that way.
Yeah.
The time period set is a big factor, right? Because it's going back to, I believe, 1936 is when the film is actually pieced at. So it's a period piece, but it's also kind of a romanticized version of that time period, and that's the one distinguishing quality about George Lucas kind of films, is that they feel like it's their own world. It feels kind of whimsical and fantasy like, and that's what I think delivers that timeless quality to it. You can almost think of this when you're thinking like The Mummy tried to do this, and I think one of the reasons why that film feels timeless in a very similar way, doesn't quite achieve the same level as Raiders, but one of the reasons why is because they do set it as a period piece, which is similar to this film. And it's a juxtaposition between the adventure films that came out in the 80s and a lot of the 80s fare at that time and the 70s fare at that time. They were very contemporary pieces. This was, because it was set back in the 1930s, I think really kind of helped it establish this this timeless quality, and the effects that they feature in Raiders, outside of a couple, really do hold up quite well. And that also contributes to it, because I think the dated CGI, I think in Mummy kind of holds it back from being truly timeless in the same way Raiders is.
Yeah, yeah, those are really great points. I totally agree that it's timeless. The things that I picked up on, the things that I pick up on, and I kind of miss from 70s and 80s films, is that 70s and 80s films, particularly 80s films, had this audacious quality to them. And that was that it really felt like the writers and directors sat down and said, we're going to have scenes in this film that will make audiences feel every emotion, which is not a contemporary thing. Like we brought up Christopher Nolan earlier. Christopher Nolan's not making you laugh. Like maybe every once in a long while he'll like throw in a joke here or there, but like he goes in with a specific mindset and says, I'm going to go deep into this film. It's going to be very hyper realistic. And what would it be like to be in this? Whereas in the 80s, I mean, I'm thinking about like classic 80s films like Back to the Future, right? Where it's like, we're going to make you laugh. We're going to make you cry. We're going to make you worried. We're going to make you sit on the edge of your seat. They just went for every single type of emotion. And in that regard, I think Raiders is very much I think that the way I categorize 80s films is that if they're trying to scare you, if they're trying to have an adventure, if they're trying to have action, whatever, it's still going to be fun overall. Now, there's some exceptions to that, right? Yeah. But the blockbusters were, for the most part, really fun. And I don't think you could describe like a Christopher Nolan film. I love Christopher Nolan, by the way. He's one of my favorite directors of all time. But I would never describe his films as fun, particularly, right?
Right.
And so I think that is a product of its time. And that seems to be getting harder and harder and harder to reproduce. Because to both your points, with there being some problematic elements of the film, for example, there's clearly people who are not the ethnicity that they're supposed to be portraying in the scene where he's in Nepal. So there's those kind of elements there that are a little uncomfortable.
They call him Baloch.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is he Egyptian? I'm not sure.
No. Right. I mean, so but the overarching feeling is we're not trying to make a statement about culture. We're not trying to make we're not the intent here is not to say that we should have cast this like an indigenous person or not cast an indigenous person. The intent here was we were just trying to make a really fun film, and there was no intent to offend. There was no, it's not like they are any kind of jokes that they work in. This will I'm sure come up on the Temple of Doom podcast that we do, but when they're eating the chilled monkey brains, that's not a joke that says let's laugh at people who live in India because they're eating chilled monkey brains. That's a joke that says Americans aren't very cultured. So what's the craziest stuff that we could put in front of an American that would make them queasy? So it's like, it's not intended. I don't think that that's always true. Like, for example, I really enjoy Big Trouble in Little China. But I think that there's some elements of that film where they're going like, let's make fun of Chinese Americans, right? Like, I don't get that same feeling here. I don't get the same intent here.
It's like there's like an innocence.
Yes.
know?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
they're not trying. They're not shooting for realism.
No.
Right.
Exactly. They're not trying to fool you that this is a documentary or anything. I mean, they just, you're right. They just want to have fun. And that's because that the movies that they grew up with in the 30s and 40s were all adventure movies that just were not interested in telling obviously you have to have it based in some reality.
Yes.
Or else it just doesn't work. Right.
Right.
And people can't connect with it.
Right.
But yet I think the notion that these guys have, at least when they're making these movies at this time anyway, are people are going to the movies because they want to have a fantasy. They want to forget about things. They just want an adventure. They want everything. And we're going to give them everything. As you said, Jay, we're going to put everything into this movie. We're going to make you laugh. We're going to make you cry. We're going to thrill you. We're going to scare you. We're going to do all this. I think now people are just like, we're just going to scare you.
Yes.
Or we're just going to make you laugh. It's sort of like the SNL joke. Like, it's just like, we're just going to tell that joke until it just rerun it to the ground. And that's all we're going to do. We're not going to strive to do anything more than that. And yeah, I mean, it takes skill to do what they did back then. And I think I mean, I hate to sound like an old man, but I think back then that you just had more skilled people making movies.
I think you did. I think you had I think you had skilled people making movies that were really in tune with the culture and what people wanted to see, right? And that kind of, it wasn't just, oh, we're going to make a film just for us. It was also, let's keep the audience in mind here, and deliver something that was really, really fun, right? I think you do get, when you get movies that feature multiple emotions, a lot of times you get movies that, like, the tonal shifts are just sporadic. I think that the best example, contemporary example of this is like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, right? Great emotions depicted in that, but man, they swing from one emotion to the other in that film.
Oh, fast, yeah.
Sometimes within the same like 5 minutes.
yeah.
In the same 5 minutes. Yeah, it's just crazy in that film. Whereas you have scenes in here that are like, very powerful and moving, and they let them breathe a little bit. I think one of the best examples of this is when he's setting up the staff of Ra, right? And you get a little comedy there with Sala. Even that's kind of dimmed down a little bit. There was supposed to be more that was cut out, but they really let that scene play and be as powerful as it is. And it's like, wow, now the arc has its own weight added to this. We haven't really seen much of that, except for that expository scene in the beginning. But now it's like, okay, this is real. This is something. By the way, it also features one of my favorite movie mistakes, right? So the staff of Ra on the medallion is supposed to be, 72 inches, right?
Yeah.
6 kadam height. And then the twist is that on the back, you take off 1 kadam to honor the Hebrew god. Okay. Well, that makes it now 5 feet, right? It's 5 feet that staff is supposed to be.
Right.
Well,
it's still over his head.
Right, it's over his head. That makes him 4 feet high? And we know Harrison Ford is 6 feet. So it's one of my favorites right there. But outside of that, it's at that powerful sequence, or you have that kind of love scene that plays out between Mary and Indy, kind of dotted throughout the film, which is quite nice. But there's definitely a sense of adventure. The sense the emotions present in this kind of thing, they're very fun, and they handle those tonal shifts, I thought quite well.
Yeah. One of the things, so for those of you who are listening to the podcast, the audio version, at the end, Mike and I are going to spend some time talking about what writers and storytellers can learn from this film. And Dre, you just brought up one of the points that I'm going to make, and I'll get into how and why. But just to quickly tack on to what you said, the pacing in this film is a work of art unto itself. You can have an expository scene. You can draw out certain moments. I think that there's two things that you each brought up that films are pressured to do today that is perhaps undue pressure on a creative person. One is we live in a TikTok generation, and if there is not something happening that is enticing you to not look away from your phone, you're probably checking it during a movie, right? Like, as much as I hate to say that, I still do that myself. So I have to be very engrossed in the movie. In fact, sometimes I like to just not have my phone on me because I want to be able to see what's going on. The other thing, though, is that the 1980s had far more of a monoculture than we see today. Not that there were not subcultures that didn't exist in the 80s. There for sure were, but those subcultures were a little smaller. And what the internet has allowed us to do is be able to find people who are in our subculture. And so then we can find places where we go, our subculture. We saw it with Star Wars because we saw the Reylos. The Reylos were a subculture, and the Reylos were like, if this doesn't happen in these films, I hate it. Right now that's maybe a little harsh. Not all Reylos would say it that boldly, but they really wanted the whole Rey and Kylo Ren relationship to happen. That creates a subculture that then is displeased with whatever the result is. And you would have had people back in the day when we had more of a monoculture that would have said, well, I would have preferred it if it would have ended this way or gone this way, but they didn't found groups about it because they didn't know that there are other people that existed that felt that same way. And so the creatives didn't felt the same amount of pressure. It applies to ethnicity. It applies to country of origin and what those subcultures would want to see in a movie. It applies to socioeconomic any way you can divide the country can be divided into a subculture effectively,
Sure.
right? And so we didn't have the creatives of that time were not worried as much about that because they were primarily creating film for the monoculture of America at that time, and it was a little bit more consistent. And I think that a lot of times what we see today is there's a lot of pressure to include lots of different elements, and once you start including lots of different elements, you tend to start to swing toward a specific subculture, and by definition you may cut out other subcultures. And so they didn't have that kind of pressure. But yeah, that's a fun discussion, because I think that's it's really interesting to look at it and go like, wow, I grew up in the 80s, you grew up in the 90s, Mike, it sounds like you grew up in the 70s, so like we all have
80s,
this, yeah, 3 decades of people growing up at different times that all go, this was amazing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's just pretty cool. So here's one that hit me this time around. I love the introduction of each character that is displayed in this film. So, Mike, which character introduction is your favorite and why?
Everything is done so well and so skilled. I mean, it's hard for me to argue that, again, with the opening sequence, that the way we get to meet Indiana Jones is not one of the best introductions of a character of all time, especially if you are basically setting up, I'm going to start a franchise with this guy. I mean, you really figure, like, you find, like, the way he's introduced, it's like, should I know who this guy is? Because the way that they're building it, it's like this big return of a major figure, and it's one that's new, and which is amazing. So it's hard for me to argue with against that, but I will, because man, I love Marion's introduction. You don't get back then, and even today, you don't get introductions to the sort of the love interest, the female, the femme fatale character. You don't get those as well introduced as she is. She's tough as nails. The extension of that is when she and Indy are reunited, and that's shot so beautifully with the shadow of him when he enters and her reaction. It's just stunning. And I don't know if I've ever seen since or before any introduction to any sort of love interest, female character, whatever you want to call it, better done than that.
Beautifully said. What about you, Dre? What do you think? What's your favorite character introduction here?
Yeah, Marion's great because, man, she's a very dynamic character. You know, we get these kind of cookie cutter, strong, independent female characters now, but there's layers with Marion, and it's depicted throughout the entire film, but definitely eloquently, beautifully set up with her introduction. And honestly, I think that's the scene they chose to test the various female actors, actresses, I should say, that auditioned for the role. Right, that was the sequence, because you had to get that right.
Yeah.
And that chemistry had to be, in 2 seconds right there. I think it's just beautifully done. One of the best setups ever, for sure. But I gotta go back to Indy, man. The Indiana Jones.
Yeah. I mean, I can't argue with you.
Right. The introduction for that character was done so well. Like you said, there when it came to setting up, Indy and this kind of established character, right? We've seen the kind of hero's journey by that point with Luke Skywalker, and he becomes a hero, but he has kind of an origin that we follow along with. In this character with Indiana Jones, he's already set up to be like a guy that you should take seriously, and in a time period where you have kind of, I guess, edgy heroes. He definitely has that edge, but he has some good qualities that define him as a character that is so relatable throughout the piece. But just setting him up with the whole, the guy tries to kill him with a gun, he hears it, whips him, that sets up so much, right? First of all, he's an absolute badass right there. Second of all, people want to kill him, and he is hanging out with these kind of underground cats right here. So it says something about that. How he goes with his companion who's very, very scared going to this temple, and he kind of handles it, and the way he handles it. Also, we get introductions to not only Belloc within that same time period. It's about 10 minutes into the film. I mean, literally when the guy, with the darkness back has fallen down, I think it's 10 minutes at that point, which is very interesting. But we also get an introduction to Forresto. Everybody forgets his competition there. But it says something. It says something also about Indy's character, and with the whole light and how he kind of makes his way through the temple, and then finally when he sees the idol, push them to the side. It's like, this one scares me kind of thing. It's like, ooh, this is a kind of a big defining moment for this character. And you're in at that point. You're ready to jump into any adventures that he's willing to jump into from that point on. I think it's probably the best character introduction ever. There's a good point there. This established character that, have we seen him before in film? Because they're definitely making him out to be this kind of big guy. I think the closest analogy to that in our contemporary cinematic experience is probably John Wick, right? But that's drawn out to the course of the entire film. Whereas this, in about that first 10 minutes, you get everything that you're going to get with Indiana Jones and more. So I think just brilliantly done.
Yeah. I'm going to pick up on a couple other introductions that I really enjoy. But then I'll get back to, Indy and Marion are basically the two that are just premier. And that is, you mentioned Belloc, and Belloc shows up, and the first thing that we see is that he's never been on screen, and Indy comes out. He's been successful. He's almost died several times in the last few minutes. And then Belloc is just sitting there in a pristine white suit. You get the impression that he has not worked an ounce in his life. And he looks at Indiana Jones and he goes, once again, we've proven that there's not one item you can't get that I can't take away from you, right? And so it's like, that is just so mind-blowingly good. And he's got all of the locals behind him in that scene.
If only you spoke Carlitos.
Exactly. Exactly.
If only.
Yeah, and for a guy who's renowned for speaking different languages too, so it's like the one he doesn't know. Oh, that's just so good. So I love that character introduction as well, because it sets up so much about who these characters are. First of all, he's either French or Belgian. I'm not sure. I think he's French. And Indy is American. And so Indy's the guy that is doing all of this, his own, I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps. But then the French guy comes in and is like, I'm going to use the Germans of ill repute and the natives that don't know that you're the good guy, because I'm going to steal this from you. Like the whole way that is portrayed is phenomenal. The other introduction that I think is so subtly terrifying is we're trying to avoid the word for the party of Germans that took over, because we don't want any issues with YouTube. But for the main German character who gets the way that he what is that called, the staff of Ra, the top of the staff,
the
of Ra?
medallion,
the medallion. I was gonna say the one that he gets that burned into his hand. The way he is introduced is so terrifying as well, because we know that he's on the airplane with Indy when Indy starts to head out, but we don't really get an introduction to him so much as we know that Indy's being followed by somebody. But then when we see him, is Indy's already left, and we know Marion's by herself, which is now terrifying, because we know she's tough, but she's by herself in the middle of nowhere, and we know that this guy is following Indy, and then he shows up in her place. And it's like, and he gives the whole Heil salute, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is much deeper and worse than I expected.
And they play on that too, because this guy who's like really kind of a scary dude who has done some pretty awful things even up to that point, they play on that a little bit with the whole hanger gag, which I think is just phenomenal. It's so good. Plays so good every time. Even in the theater, I was watching this in last year. The whole room laughed, and it's just like, that's it right there.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah, it's so good. So I will say that all those introductions are phenomenal. It's really interesting that we don't see the head of the German party even once, even though he is one of the main villains of this movie, which is really fascinating.
We'll see him soon, though.
We'll see him eventually. Yeah. We actually get to see him in my wife's. She laughed so hard when that scene is on. She sees that scene so funny. I'm like, yeah, it's true. It's really funny. But I would have to say, if Indiana Jones is the best character introduction of all time, which I'm willing to go along with that statement, then I think that Marion is maybe number 2 because to see, first of all, there is a lady who doesn't belong in that area. We know it's very far away from where Indy is. And what she's doing is having a drinking contest. And by the way, if you ever see the behind the scenes of Spielberg directing that scene, he is being meticulous. Like, he's like, no, turn it over and then wait. And now slap. Like, it's crazy. And the fact that she plays with the guy, she's in control the whole time, but we don't know it because we think that when we first see her, she's going to have to give up before the guy, but then he falls over backwards and it makes everybody upset. And then the fact that when she starts interacting with Indiana Jones, one of the first things she does is punch him in the face. The guy that we know is one of the toughest guys around at this point. I mean, all of that serves to set up a character who is... And I'm not sure that we see another character in Indiana Jones that fits this profile, but is as much worthy of being in his space as he is. Yeah. Right? Like you can take Marcus Brody. You can take, now it works again with Henry Sr. because they brought in Sean Connery. And that's amazing casting. But the fact that they go Indiana Jones, if he's going to go head to head with anybody, that it has to be a person that we all assume can go head to head with him. And there are not a lot of people who you can cast in that role because they've portrayed to us how amazing of a character he is. But Karen Allen as Marion can go toe to toe with him every step of the way, and it works perfectly. So
because in the introduction, I think you could argue that it doesn't play out as well as it could have based on the introduction.
That's fair.
I mean, she does get relegated to your typical screaming lady more than a few times in the rest of the movie, which is unfortunate because she starts off so strong.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. Because, even him having to tell her to close her eyes is a little bit pejorative in that moment. And the fact that they put her in a nice dress and then she has to wear the nice dress the whole time. You're right. There is some there that does. It's maybe not, and that is something we'll get into in a future show, is the characterization of female characters in light of Indiana Jones, because that is one of the easier things to point at to say that's kind of weaker on that side of it.
Well, it's also the 1930s, right? And and the independent, I kind of get it. I kind of get what they were doing there, and think about the people who are putting her in those positions. They're bad, right? They're right. Not good people. So I can kind of let it slide just a little bit. I think there's also a very a rich feminine vulnerability there. I think that is preserved. That I think maintains the stakes of what's going on there. She just get caught in the cockpit. Okay, all right, it's not great, but even it ratchets up the tension that scene. She's kind of the fish out of the water character in a lot of that. That creates a resonance with the audience, a relatability with the audience, which I think is good. And she's a good foil for the kind of grizzled veteran that is Harrison Ford. So I think. Could it have been handled better? Obviously, but I think you have to have that character present, and I think she plays that well. And I think by the end of it, you still feel that she's a very, very capable woman, without question. And hey, you had to tell somebody to keep their eyes closed. So there you go.
That's right. That's right. I have one more question for us, but one of the things that I forgot to bring up if it felt like it was a part of the 70s and 80s or not. This is widely known at this point, but Tom Selleck was originally going to be cast in the role of Indy. I don't know if it would feel as timeless if that had happened, because Tom Selleck was very much a a heartthrob of the 80s, right? Like in his in his role as Magnum PI. Not that he didn't have, he has a long and illustrious career, but he was, between Magnum PI and the Quigley Down Under series and some of these things, he was he very much, I think that if they had cast him as Indy, it would have felt a little bit more like James Bond and a little less like an original new kind of character, just because we already saw him as the suave guy. I don't see him having the little like as Magnum PI. Does he run into issues and stuff like that? Yes, he does, but he very rarely. Magnum PI, the show might treat that as like a comedic moment, but very rarely does Tom Selleck. He's always cool. In this, Harrison Ford does this amazing thing where he turns on the coolness and turns off the coolness, and it's almost because he doesn't care if he's cool. He never seems to be trying to be cool, but it'd be very hard to convince me that Tom Selleck was not trying to be cool at all times. And by the way, I'm not saying that Tom Selleck, that's better or worse. I'm just saying for this role, it seems like Harris. Yeah, exactly. It's very, very different. So how do you feel about that?
No, I think we all dodged a bullet there with that not working out. I mean, no offense to Tom Selleck, but like you're right. I think Harrison Ford brings an everyman quality to Indiana Jones that everybody can instantly relate to. It's the difference between, like, if you want to go back old school, golden age of Hollywood, it's the difference between like Bogart doing a role and Cary Grant. Yes. Tom Great Selleck is definitely more of the Cary Grant type of guy. And Bogart, I mean, there's been so many comparisons to, Harrison Ford and Bogart. They've even played the same character in remakes and whatnot. So, it's very similar vibe there that you get from both of them, where they're so like everyman.
Yeah. There were some screen tests done with Tom Selleck and I believe Karen Allen, and if you've ever seen those, there's a different flavor there. It's something, but it's just a different flavor. I liken it almost to who they were going to have play with Michael J. Fox. Sorry, I can't remember the actor's name off the top of my head.
Eric Schultz.
Yeah, Eric Schultz for Marty McFly in Back to the Future. If you ever seen those, it's like, okay, I can see what they were going for here, but definitely a different take on this character. And I think the same exists here. By the way, one of my favorite jokes in animation ever is Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers and how they depict Chip in that as, Harrison Ford from Indiana Jones and Tom Selleck from PI as a reference to that original casting. I always thought that was awesome.
That's great. Yeah, that's perfect. All right, so I got the last question. Last question here for the Story Geek show, and then if you're listening to the audio version, so if you listen to the Story Geek show, by the way, and you want to go listen to Mike and I talk about what writers and storytellers can learn from this film, you can just fast forward through to the end, because obviously you don't want to watch this or listen twice. Why not listen twice? You can do that too. Yeah, why not? So question 6 here, my last question for the Story Geek show. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg chose, and we kind of referenced this earlier, but they chose a popular religious artifact that two world religions see as grounded in important spiritual relevance, the Ark of the Covenant. Now, I'm going to paraphrase here, but the Ark was meant to be a place where Israelites could meet with God. That is a bold artifact to put in a film. We talked about the spiritual component of this a little bit, but let's focus a little bit more in on the Ark. What do you think about the inclusion of the Ark, and how does the film's depiction impact your personal concept of what the Ark was? And then how do you think that played for general audiences? I know it's a complex question, but I really want to get into this. We just created a film about the Ark of the Covenant, which the people of Jewish faith and Christian faith believe that God met with the Jewish people with that artifact. So I'm just wondering how Raiders kind of adds to the lore surrounding the Ark of the Covenant. So what do you think, Dre? How does this shape our understanding of that artifact?
I think it shapes it quite well. I mean, I don't know how much emphasis is placed in, the kind of atheistic religions or Judeo-Christian schools and stuff. I mean, he says, "Hey, didn't you ever go to Sunday school?" You know, kind of. I mean, that's kind of for the audience, right? Because I don't think a lot of people were necessarily super familiar with it before this film right here. But it's definitely a really interesting depiction of it, and it's not, I wouldn't say horribly accurate, at least in my perception of the Ark going through some of the Judeo-Christian texts and so forth. I guess it was almost like a traveling temple that the Israelites would have, when they left Egypt, and so it's supposed to have great power, great significance, for sure. And there was an aspect to it where if anybody touched it, they'd instantly perish, which I don't think is depicted so much in Raiders of the Lost Ark. That would be an interesting story point to kind of get through there. But yeah, I think it has influenced certainly many people's ideas of the Ark in its own way. But they have like I was saying before with the exposition piece in the front of that movie where he's talking about it and you see the power of it, right? And it's like, ooh, this is interesting, and how I love how they brought in the fact that the lead of this Germans of ill repute was interested in kind of these relics and so forth. Like that was a real thing. We don't actually see this again until probably Captain America is probably the next time we see this gentleman's obsession with these kind of relics and artifacts, religious artifacts and so forth. So I love how that's the kind of whole depicted and how he kind of wants it for himself. And then the way I think Belloc takes to it, right? Because Harrison's kind of indifferent to it, totally. whereas Belloc is very much like, hey, this is a gateway, a radio to God, that kind of thing. And it's like, wow, that's a really interesting kind of way of doing it right there. And of course, he gets his comeuppance at the very end. So I think it definitely has influenced. Look, I think a lot of people believe that if you open the Ark, your face might melt off. So it's an interesting idea.
Right. Yeah. I even love the way that Belloc says radio. A radio. It's like really rolls the R. Like,
speaking to God.
Yeah, exactly.
Beautiful.
What do you think, Mike? How do you think that this is? What do you think about? Part of the reason I think this topic is fascinating is because some movies have, like, let's say Crystal Skull, let's be realistic, have lived or died upon the paranormal supernatural thing that they chose, and people just went, I'm not going along with that. Right. But so what do you think about this? How does Raiders kind of shape our understanding of the Ark and how that works?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't know if it's because I was only 12 or 13 when this came out, or the secular nature of where I grew up, or whatever. But I had no clue before this movie came out what the Ark of the Covenant was. In fact, it was highly regarded by many people I knew at the time that our first thought when we hear Ark is Noah, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And so I think having that exposition scene at the beginning was really educational, really helpful for everybody going to see this movie.
Yeah.
Definitely an interesting choice. The way I understand it is that before Spielberg got involved in the project, this was a project that George wanted to make with writer and director Philip Kaufman. And they created the character together of Indiana Jones, and it was Philip Kaufman who came up with the idea. First, he wanted to. They needed something. I think George just wanted something occultish, right? And Philip's first idea was the Spear of Destiny, because that's what famously, I think, the head of that party, the main big bad of World War II, was really looking for.
And he got it, from what I understand, right? I think.
Well, it depends on what you believe. That's another movie.
That's an interesting one right there.
But so So that was a big key. So and for whatever reason, they decided not to use that, and instead the most powerful Christian symbol that Kaufman could think of, and I do believe that he is Jewish, was the Ark of the Covenant. And I think, looking back on it now, and even at the time, it was a brilliant move because it was something that a lot of us weren't familiar with.
Yeah.
And so you had the flexibility to take some liberties with the origin and with the how everything works and everything like that. But it also, was educational for a lot of us because we had no idea what it was. So, and I think since then, I think this movie, if anybody does know what the Ark of the Covenant is, I think it's because of this
from this movie.
Right. And even at that time, there was a mystery around the Ark, right? Like where to go, and there have been some tribes out there that have claimed that they have it and they don't show it to anybody. It's like, okay, but there's a mystery there of like where did it go? And the Raiders of the Lost Ark title, it plays into that for sure. But it's just a great approach because, like you said, it's not something that's super familiar with everybody, so you can kind of play with that a little bit, and it's not like super obvious. Like I think the Holy Grail is a little obvious as you're first out. It works, I think, in Last Crusade. But
it does work in the third movie. You don't want to bring that up in the first movie, but
exactly.
And the other thing about it too is that it's based in reality, and it's, I mean, even if you look at the actual lore behind it, it is very powerful.
Yes.
It is amazing that hasn't been brought up prior to this movie because it's one of those artifacts or it's one of those things, those legends that's like, wow, this thing has tremendous power associated with it. How am I just hearing about it now?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I totally agree with both of you. And I think that it was like, it's almost kind of its own little, again, these are such collaborative projects that it's another lucky thing. It's like not that it was not thought about and planned out, and I'm not saying that, but just the fact that they included this, when you start to pull all of the pieces in, you're like, yeah, there's a certain amount of luck here that you just could not replicate because it's just they chose the right artifact, they chose the right actor, they chose the right setting, they chose all of it. And I think that one of the ways that it works really well too is that based on my understanding of what the Ark was, at least that's how it's taught, there's only two things that I think you could probably make an argument were maybe pushed into the bounds of like, well, that's not in any of the material that this is based on. And those two things are when they're looking at the actual art in the Bible, and he's like, see here, the beams coming out of the power of God, right? Like that's probably nowhere in any sort of lore or writings about the Ark of the Covenant. Now that's coming from Indiana Jones, who's again a skeptic, not a believer, right? So he's just saying like, well, this is one of the depictions, and in this artwork, that's how it's depicted. However,
power of God or something.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
I'm beginning to see his interest in this.
Oh yeah, we could do a whole podcast on just that scene. By the way,
yeah,
so well done. So
just
well
the
done.
fact that they have Porkins is in that scene.
Oh right, yeah, sure.
It's just amazing. But I think that's one thing that's probably extracurricular, you call it, right? The other thing is, because I think Dre, one of the things that's really interesting is it was if one of the if it wasn't a priest that touched the Ark, then yes, they would die, right?
Right.
But notice
that's accurate. Yeah.
Notice that like Indy and Sala put the wooden dowels through, and they don't touch it, and it's not actually touched physically until they remove the lid, and then he reaches his hand in to come up with all the sand, which we assume would be the tablets, right? The 10 Commandments, having withered away into just dust is what I'm assuming they're implying. So the only other piece of the lore that may be extracurricular is that when they open it up, there's these spiritual beings of some sort that then take vengeance upon. Now that is a special effect where now we're seeing the beams again, right? Because the beams actually shoot out into all the Germans of ill repute that are standing there on the Ark. And so that is a callback to what Indy said about the picture. And so they're kind of just displaying the picture there to a degree. But what I found fascinating is that I think that if you watch that film, I have to now. Of course, I'm speaking from a Christ follower's perspective, not a Jewish person of the Jewish faith. But I don't see this as being so out of alignment with what would have been something that we would have said may have been true. That you would be like, I refuse to even be in the vicinity of it. You know.
And that's a distinct quality, because you can't necessarily, you don't want to offend anybody, right? So
exactly,
I think it's done just to the degree where it's like they play with it for cinematic purposes, but it's still impactful. And Jesus, that score! Oh
my gosh!
Get yourself a good sound system, folks, and turn that up on that scene. Oh man, it's amazing.
I also think that it's set up story-wise too, because it's really it's not the first, like if they just waited until the very last scene to show something supernatural like that, it would have been like, oh, well, this is kind of like, out of nowhere or whatever. That's convenient. But the scene where it's on the boat, and it sort of burns through the symbol and the rats are going crazy. I mean, it tells us right there that there's something really powerful in there that is otherworldly.
Yes.
Well, and also too, the even when they're decoding the staff of Ra, you see the wind come in, the chimes going. It's like, oh, that's a little weird. That's a little strange. So there's some foreshadowing there, like you said, that just sets it up unbelievably
little
beautiful.
Piece by little piece, so that when it's finally really but there at the end where it doesn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. And to tack on a little bit more to the foreshadowing, which again is brilliance. It's just absolute brilliance. Even the scene where Marion is left alone when we've introduced her, he films the beginning of that scene as if has a paranormal element to it, because the doors are all closed, but the wind whips through, it takes out the candle. Exactly. And so and we see her grab the actual head of the staff. So they're building in this idea that there's a paranormal component to this thing. Notice that I think that's actually probably one of the first things where we see evidence of it, because before that, the only thing that we see is that we see in South America, we see the guy see the symbol on the wall and freaks out, right? Doesn't that happen? Or am I thinking of Temple of Doom? Does it happen in both places?
Well, the two guides run across like some statue. Some statue, and they like a bunch of them flee, and all of them flee, like all the underlings flee or whatever. And then, of course, when Belloc raises the idol, they all bow.
Yeah. And those things can all be interpreted as Indy being like, these are just the people that don't understand what I understand.
Right.
And so it's when we transition into now he's chasing something that actually has more that he's not going to be able to deny. So it's not to say that the fertility idol wasn't something, but he's been able to excuse any kind of spiritual components to it until we start to see those things even before he does, which makes the moment even better. And I think that's just phenomenal. So we'll go ahead and close out this portion of the show. I could not ask to have two people talk about this with me that I would have not enjoyed more. So thank you guys for joining me.
It's been amazing.
Yeah, it's been a really good time. Mike and I, we're going to go ahead and do our outros, but then stay tuned to the podcast version, because Mike and I are going to talk a little bit more about writing and storytelling related to Raiders. But Dre, why don't you close us out? Tell people where they can find you and what you're up to.
What I'm up to, what am I not up to, man? There's so much here, but if you want to keep track of that story, you can go to at VashSky on Twitter. It's right down there. Just go ahead, type it in, and it should pop up for as I can't do it now because now she's out, but there's more to that story, I think. Christine Way Sons McCarthy, we'll get into that, but if you want to hear my initial thoughts on that whole situation and more, you can definitely find us at Orange Grove 55 for sure. We have some amazing shows, including the one you're watching right now, Story Geeks with Jay, talking about the stories that impact our lives for sure. Citrus Corner with our dear friend George, we talk about everything Walt Disney World related, and Orange Grove 55 Have an Orange Nerd, hosted by OG himself, where we talk about everything related to the entertainment industry. It is a fascinating time, folks. A very transitional time for sure. So if you want to go ahead and subscribe to that, including my own show, Freshly Squeezed, your source for juice, news, and info, squeezed fresh right from the Grove, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for sure.
Every time I hear those things, they make me so nostalgic. I can't help it. I've heard it so many times, and it still makes me nostalgic.
That's fantastic.
Mike Gordon, tell the folks where they can
bring an
find
audio
you.
cue. I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, you're fine. I got you. Don't even worry. I got you.
Where can people find you, Mike, and what are you up to?
Well, first of all, thanks again for the invite. It's always great chatting with you, Jay, especially about my favorite movie. I could go on and on, so I appreciate that. Dre, it was nice meeting you as well, chatting alongside you. That was great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if you want to hear me prattle on some more, you can hear me twice a week on Earth Station 1. We are available on all the podcasting platforms and on YouTube. We actually have a YouTube channel, and you can see our shows on YouTube twice a week as well. And then, of course, if you want to look up any of the projects that I'm working on, any of the books that I've done, Tiki Zombie is a big one, of course. And you can find out all of that. Just go to newlegendmike.com or tikizombie.net.
Awesome. There you go. Definitely go check all of those things out for sure. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can follow me at Jay Sherer. I'm not as active on Twitter as I used to be because I don't know that Twitter is helping anybody out in their life. But every once in a while you'll find me on Twitter. But you can also find me right here on Orange Grove 55's network doing how the Story Geeks show. I also have a podcast called How Stories Work. That is audio only. There is a YouTube channel. I will sometimes put content out there as well. And that's what Mike and I are going to continue as we continue to talk about Raiders of the Lost Ark and the impact that it has for writers and storytellers and what we can learn from it. That's a little bit more about what How Stories Work is about. But How Stories Work also has our original stories or original films. We are currently in the process of producing another short film. And it's been going really, really well, and I've been really excited about it. So if you want to support that short film, we actually are fully funded for the film, but there's a couple other things that I would like to upgrade. So if you'd like to support us over there, you can support us on Indiegogo. Just check out one of the links on the How Stories Work channel, and you can find us over there. And it should be really fun to get that one filmed and out to everybody. So again, guys, fantastic conversation. I'm sure that we could do 3 or 4 shows just like this and have a great time. But we'll close it out right there. And I appreciate you guys both joining me.